A couple points. There's a very famous book entitled Truth is the First Casualty. And the argument is that when a war breaks out, because the propaganda machines on both sides immediately go to work, the end result is that truth gets washed out of the picture and propaganda becomes of enormous importance. The case I know best where you saw this was during the Vietnam War. And some of it revolved around casualty counts, or what were then called body counts. And there was tremendous pressure put on the American military to inflate body counts because you really needed an indicator of success. The American public was saying, what kind of progress are we making here? What are the indicators that we're actually making progress? And of course, President Johnson and his lieutenants as well put pressure on the American military to indicate that we were, or give indicators that we were making great progress against the Viet Cong and the NVA. So body counts became the principal instrument for convincing the upper echelons of the Johnson administration and the public that we were winning the war. And you created this fantasy world where huge numbers of Vietnamese were dying, and therefore the storyline was that we were winning the war. And in fact, everybody who was involved in the process fully understood that we were acting in extremely dishonest ways for the purpose of satisfying the commanders who wanted to be able to make the case that we were winning. And if you look at a lot of the battles that took place during the war, we suffered enormous casualties. And in many of those cases, you could argue we won, but if we won, we barely won. But nevertheless, we described those battles as great victories. We went to great lengths to make it look like we were winning when we weren't winning. And this is why we lost the war. We were not making progress. If you actually look at what people like Johnson and others actually knew, and this even includes Westmoreland, what they actually knew about what was going on the battlefield from 65 on. Remember, we go in March 65 in a big way. They understood that we were in deep trouble. And despite the fact that they kept spinning these stories that we were doing well, that the body counts proved that, they understood at the same time that we were not doing well. And they were constantly searching for the magic formula, which they could never find and never did find, and therefore we lost the war. But you just don't want to underestimate the extent to which a national security establishment, when it goes to war, will pursue propaganda in really extreme ways. Now, I think there are two big differences between the Vietnam situation and the present situation. One is that we've just gotten much more sophisticated at it. It's really quite amazing how good we are across the West. It's spinning out these stories that are really false narratives. We were not quite so good in the Vietnam War, right? We've gotten much better at it. The elites have really become quite skillful at propagandizing. And the second big difference is, I think that during the Vietnam War, and this was evident in the comments I made a few minutes ago, while people were spinning positive stories, and this included people like Westmoreland and the military chiefs, and it included, of course, LBJ and his lieutenants. Well, they were spinning positive stories. At the same time, they knew that we were in deep trouble. They were aware of the fact that they were distorting the truth to keep support for the war in place. I think today, and this gets back to our earlier conversation, I think today most Western elites believe that we are actually doing very well in Ukraine, and that the Ukrainians themselves are performing well on the battlefield, that the Russians have been at least stymied, and maybe even the tide has turned. And furthermore, when you look at these Russian casualties, you look at the disastrous state of the Russian economy, you look at the fact that so many people are interested in overthrowing Putin, really all we have to do is just keep pushing and we're going to win a victory. It's going to happen. And people believe that. You and I think, again, that this is ludicrous, but we're a minority voice here. All sorts of people believe this in the West. And all of this tells you, by the way, Glenn, that the only thing that's going to dispel all these foolish notions about what's going on is a Russian victory on the battlefield. If the Russians roll up the Donbass, or once the Russians roll up the Donbass, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and then they begin to move on to other oblasts, assuming they do that, then it'll be impossible to maintain this narrative. What enables people in the West to sustain this narrative is the slow progress of the Russian army. The fact is the Russians have moved very slowly to roll up the Ukrainians. And by the way, to go back to the previous subject we were talking about, casualties, one of the reasons I believe these Russian casualty numbers are simply wrong is that the Russians pursue their offensives in a very cautious way because they are interested in minimizing casualties. If you look carefully at Russian tactics on the battlefield and Russian strategy more generally, they go to enormous lengths to minimize the number of casualties. So this is a case where huge numbers of Russians are not dying in mindless frontal attacks that fail, as many in the West would like you to believe. The Russians are very cautious. They're suffering casualties for sure, especially because there are all those Ukrainian drones up in the sky. But the casualty numbers are not that high. And this, of course, is why that New York Times story is laughable.
Yeah, well, I think this is a key thing, what you said about Vietnam, but that is that they lie to, essentially they lie about the war to buy time in order to find that magic formula you refer to. And I think that's also what happened in Afghanistan. If you look at the Afghanistan papers, they knew things weren't going well and they did cover it up. And again, why would you fight a losing war? And I do think that the assumption is if you can just keep it going, hope, you cling on to hope, something might turn up, the economy could collapse, the fronts could collapse, or worst case, gradually drain the enemy so they will end up weaker thereafter. I mean, I'm assuming, we had other ideal outcomes for Libya, Syria, all of these countries, but, worst case, one drains and destabilizes the enemy. But it's also interesting what you said about how to measure success, because if you look at Ukraine, the best way or favorite way by the Western political media establishment has been to measure progress based on territorial shifts. But as you and I know, that doesn't make much sense when you're fighting a war of attrition, because you don't spend all your forces fighting, storming well-fortified lines. You drain and weaken the adversary, and once the front line collapses, then you take the territories. I mean, once the front lines now collapse, the Russians can move faster and faster without the defensive lines as well. So measuring territory in a war of attrition doesn't really make sense. But that's what I find interesting, because in the Iran war, they always appear to measure deaths, but that doesn't really make much sense. That is, Trump always point to, look at the Navy, their Air Force, everything's gone, but measuring death and destruction as success doesn't really make much sense if the Iranians can hold on to the Strait of Hormuz with very cheap, simple drones, and also they're willing to absorb all this pain because doesn't matter how many of them you kill, they're still going to be willing to fight, and they're still going to be willing to produce the capabilities required to keep that strait closed. So, as you said, the KPIs or the indicators of success is very strange, or perhaps deliberately so strange, how they measure success.
Can I just jump in here, Glenn? We were just talking about casualty numbers in the Ukraine war and what the New York Times has been reporting. This is the same as body counts, right? This is a body count argument. This is just like Vietnam. Very important to understand that. You pointed out, quite correctly, of course, that in the West, we often talk about the failure of the Russians to capture territory. And you say that that's not a good indicator when you're in a war of attrition. And that, of course, is true. And in a war of attrition, what matters is the casualty exchange ratio. And the casualty exchange ratio is effectively the same as body counts. So what you see going on here with this New York Times piece is very similar to what you saw with body counts in Vietnam. And the body count process in Vietnam was fundamentally dishonest. Very important to understand that. And the body count process in Ukraine, as we discussed about the New York Times article, is fundamentally dishonest. And it's exactly what you would expect. I want to make another point. Very important to understand that the Vietnam War and the Ukraine War were ground wars, or are ground wars, or is a ground war in the Ukraine case and was a ground war in the Vietnam case. I have to get my tenses right here. There were ground wars where armies were crashing into each other and huge numbers of people were dying. So body counts or casualty exchange ratios mattered. In the Gulf, in the Iran war today, there's no ground war. Remember that the initial part of the war from February 28th to April 8th was fought in the air. That was the air war from February 28th to April 8th. Then the air war ended. The bombing effectively ended, except for two minor blips later on we could talk about. But the air war basically ended, and we segued to a blockade. It was April 13th when we moved to a blockade. And the blockade ended when we signed the Memorandum of Understanding. That was June 17th. So we went from a bombing campaign to a blockade, and we never launched a ground offensive. And so there's no body count argument at play in the Iran war. It's a very different kind of conflict. And to be more specific about the Iran case, as everybody said, if you really wanted to achieve the goals that the Israelis and the Americans set out for themselves on February 28th, you would need boots on the ground. There's the ground option. And we were unwilling on February 28th, and at any point since then, to put boots on the ground, at least in any meaningful way. So we've never gone near that ground option, because when you go to the ground option, that's when you really suffer serious casualties. And when you suffer really serious casualties, it becomes much more difficult to justify the war. And that's why the body counts and the casualty exchange ratios attract so much attention.
So, no, I agree. But also, yeah, with Iran, you would have thought the US would have greater success, though. That is, it did stay away from the ground war because as a naval power such as the United States, history suggests it should stay out of ground wars, be it Vietnam, Iraq, that this is not playing to America's strength. But in Iran, you had naval power, air power, so it should, I guess, have assumed the greater success on the American side. On the other hand, you can't really win a war with air power alone either. But how do you measure success in the war against Iran? On behalf of the Americans, that is, how would you measure progress? Because it's a very unique kind of war. Is it the destruction of ballistic missiles, offensive capabilities, defensive capabilities? Is it removing proxies or allies, be it Lebanon, Iraq, or Yemen? How would we know if the United States would be winning the war against Iran?
A couple of points. One is we're not going to win the war. We're going to lose the war. But in the process of losing the war, we have two goals that we need to achieve. And if we come out of this in reasonably good shape, we will have achieved those two goals. But it's just very important to understand that Iran has won this war. Iran is going to emerge from this war much more powerful relative to its neighbors than it was on February 27th. America's position in the Gulf is going to be greatly weakened as a result of this war. But I want to get to your specific question because it is terribly important. We have two goals here. Putting aside the question whether we win or lose, we have two goals. Number one is to open the strait because we got to get oil flowing. And that will include Iranian oil, which we're allowing to come out of the strait. And we're allowing the Iranians to get paid in dollars for that oil, right? We're giving them a good deal because we want to flood the market with oil so that the economy, the international economy, doesn't go off a cliff. So goal number one was to open the strait, get the oil flowing. Goal number two is to get a nuclear deal. We have to get a nuclear deal. It's obviously going to be some variant of the JCPOA, but there has to be some sort of deal that limits what Iran can do in terms of developing nuclear weapons moving forward. You mentioned missiles. There's going to be no agreement on missiles. Some people might say, well, what about supporting Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis? There's going to be no agreement there. Right. The regime change, that was another one of our goals. There's not going to be a regime change, not as a result, immediate result of this war, maybe in 2 or 3 or 4 years, who knows, but not now. The key issue is the nuclear issue. Now, it's very important to understand how the Memorandum of Understanding was structured. It was structured so that the shooting between, or the bombing between Iran and the United States would be shut down once the memorandum was signed. And number two, the strait would be opened and oil would flow out into world markets. Now, with regard to the bombings campaign stopped on April 8th. There was really nothing to stop. The bombing campaign ended and we went to a blockade. And we can't go back to a bombing campaign for a whole slew of different reasons, right? So that really didn't matter that much, except maybe in Lebanon. But let's leave Lebanon aside. The key issue to start with that we cared about was opening the strait. And the strait is now opened for all intents and purposes. Not fully open, but it appears that it may be fully opened. And if it isn't, we're in real trouble. But that was the least difficult goal to achieve because the Iranians have a vested interest in selling their oil. Okay. The big number two goal that's sitting out there is the nuclear issue. And that is yet to be resolved. What you want to understand here is we now have to deal with the nuclear issue side by side with 4 big economic issues that would all be advantage Iran. One is reparations. 2 is the frozen assets. 3 is lifting the sanctions. And 4 is the question of the toll booth in the strait. In other words, these issues have not been resolved. Just think about it. That $300 billion fund for reparations, not settled yet. Lifting all the sanctions, not settled yet. Releasing all the frozen assets. I'd guess there are probably over $100 billion in frozen assets. Unfreezing all of them. And then the toll booth issue. Okay, they have to be resolved, those issues. And the nuclear issue has to be resolved, right? So we have solved the problem of opening the straits for the most part in the beginning. And now we have all those other big issues staring us in the face. And I would just say to you, if we don't get a deal, we meaning the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, we don't get a deal on the nuclear issue, we're going to be in real trouble. Because, as you well know, the Iranians have the capability to quite easily build a bomb. And if we don't have something like a revised version of the JCPOA, what's going to stop them from building a bomb? So there's going to be very powerful incentives on us to get that deal, which means that we're likely to have to make major concessions to the Iranians on those four big economic issues that the Iranians care about. So there's a lot of negotiation to be done. And it just seems to me, if we're going to be successful, we've got to keep the strait open, number one. And number two, we got to get a nuclear deal.
Well, if those were the only two objectives, that is a nuclear deal and get the oil flowing, it would be achievable because, well, the Iranians weren't pursuing nuclear weapons before this war, and oil was flowing before the war as well. But as you said, there's a new objectives now. The MOU makes it very clear there's no going back to the old status quo. So the Iranians, I think they're worried as well because on one hand, it's hard to imagine the US implementing all the things it signed under with the MOU, that is ending all sanctions, getting Congress on board, giving $300 billion in reparations, accepting the toll booth or fee or whatever one wants to refer to it. It's very hard to see this being acceptable. At the same time, there's no good military option unless, Israel might be able to instigate a civil war in Lebanon, or the US could pressure Iraqi government to shut down some Iranian militant groups. I mean, one could go after allies, but it doesn't look like that's a viable strategy for military success. So I'm just, what do you think the strategy is here? Will they take a horrible peace deal, or will they take a non-existent military option, or how are you assessing what's likely based on American strategy here, or how you see the strategy at least?
Well, this is a great question. Let's just talk this through. First of all, there's no military option, as you and I know. And one reason there's no military option is that if you go back to bombing, the strait will be closed again. We can't do anything that allows the strait to be closed again. That we just got it open, and we want to keep it open. And for all these people who are talking about, let's go back and finish the job. What are they talking about? We had a 40-day bombing campaign. It didn't work. That's why we ended it on April 8th. And furthermore, we were running out of munitions. And furthermore, the Iranians have a second strike capability. And furthermore, they can really crash the world economy. So what are people talking about? We don't have a military option. We got the strait open. And now the question is, are we going to deal with the nuclear issue? You're saying, Glenn, I think quite correctly, I'm not disagreeing with you, that it's hard to imagine the Americans making those concessions that I described on what I called the four big economic issues. Okay? Again, the whole question of the toll booth, releasing all those frozen assets, almost complete sanctions relief, and the $300 billion reparations fund. Can you really see the United States conceding on all those issues? I mean, the end result would be that Iran would be in excellent shape moving forward. This is a country with 93 million people. You get its economy back on its feet. It's in a position where it dominates the Persian Gulf. It controls the Strait of Hormuz. Iran would be really quite powerful. Is America going to let this happen? That's the question you're asking. Okay. The counter to that, Glenn, is what about the nuclear issue? the Iranians are going to play hardball with us. We know that. They're going to say, if you don't dance to our tune on the economic issues, no nuclear deal. What are we going to do then? No nuclear deal? I don't know about that. We got to get a nuclear deal, I think. But if we don't get a nuclear deal, we're going to be in real trouble because there is a really good chance that they'll get nuclear weapons or they'll move in that direction. And this will cause the Israelis to think about using their nuclear weapons, Israeli nuclear weapons, against Iran. So the potential for disaster here. So we have a very powerful incentive to get a nuclear deal. Trump has a very powerful incentive to put this behind us. Just to come at this from a slightly different angle. You understand that the Iranians wanted to deal with the nuclear issue up front. Remember, I described the Memorandum of Understanding as dealing first with opening the strait, ending the shooting, that's one, and then later dealing with the nuclear issue and those big economic issues, okay? The Iranians were smart. They put the nuclear issue at the rear end of the negotiations because they knew it would give them huge leverage down the road. If they negotiated the nuclear deal and the strait deal now, right, and then later they moved to the economic issues, they'd have no leverage. The only thing that gives them leverage, they no longer have leverage because they control the strait, because they've opened the strait. Their leverage now rests with the nuclear issue. They were smart to keep the nuclear issue until the end. So they have a lot of leverage over us, and we have a vested interest in caving to them, fulfilling the various agreements that make up the Memorandum of Understanding. But maybe that won't happen. But the end result is we won't get a nuclear deal.